All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We want to welcome you and thank you everyone so much for joining us today for another installment of our research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Just a quick disclaimer before we begin today. We want to let everyone know that this webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Today, we're joined by a team of folks from Education Development Center, Inc. And they're also affiliated with the REL groups, REL Midwest and REL Northeast and Islands. And we'll be hearing about how and why public high schools are using online learning for students. Hearing about some findings from surveys that were conducted in Iowa, Wisconsin, and the New York Capital Region. With that, I will go ahead and hand it off to our presenters.
Justin and Catherine, thank you so much. Thanks for providing us with the opportunity to talk about our work today, and thanks to everyone who has joined for the session. My name is Peggy Clements, and I'm a senior research scientist at Education Development Center. Joining us, or also presenting today, are my colleagues Erin Stafford and Jackie Zweig, who worked on these studies we'll be talking about. And our colleague Angela Pazzaglia, who is also a very important contributor to the work, is actually attending as an audience member today. So feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions or comments as we move along. As Justin mentioned, we're going to be talking about two reports that were published this year by the REL program, which is the Regional Educational Laboratory Program. The REL program is under the U.S. Department of Education, and I'm going to talk about the REL program in just a second. Before I do that, I'd like to just quickly orient everyone to what our goals are in developing and presenting this session for you all today. Given that the REL program is financed by our tax dollars and does work to support education, we always make an effort when we're talking about our work to provide some information about the REL program so people know what's going on with that. We'll talk a little bit about the role of researcher, education stakeholder alliances and how we're working together to identify and conduct research studies for the REL. And then, most importantly, we'll be talking about the findings from these two recent studies. One of the reports presents the findings from two surveys, a survey that was conducted in Iowa and another survey that was conducted in Wisconsin. And then the second report presents the results of a survey that was conducted in a part of New York State. And then with you all, we hope to engage in a discussion about the educational practice implications as well as the research implications of the work. So just a quick background about the Regional Educational Laboratory Program. There are 10, the U.S. Department of Education funds 10 regional educational labs around the United States. You can see how those RELs are represented across the country. And the mission of the RELs is is to basically provide support to education stakeholders in the use of data and education research. So formally, to provide support for more evidence-reliant education systems. And the way we do this is by working in partnership with school districts, State Department of Education, and other education stakeholders to use data and research to help improve academic outcomes for students. Now, the Department of Education has emphasized the use of data and research for, I don't know, well over 15 years, or about 15 years at this point. But it's a really hard thing to do. You know, as you can imagine, education, states and districts, they have access to a great deal of data, but don't necessarily have the resources, the time, the energy, or the expertise to analyze that data. Researchers, on the other hand, know how to do research, but we need the expert input from our education stakeholder partners to help us identify regional and national educational priorities. So what are the kinds of research questions that researchers should be asking, and what's the kind of information that people that are practicing, that are that are providing education, what's the kind of what kinds of research studies are going to be most valuable to the public. As you can imagine, a researcher sitting off somewhere in his or her office may not have the best idea about what kinds of studies would be most useful to people out in the field. And so that's really how the REAL program is functioning at this point. Is really the primary focus is research that comes out of these researcher stakeholder alliances or partnerships. And so right now, one of the things I want to do really quickly is just acknowledge the important work that our research alliance partners have done with us. And so for the REAL Midwest study that we'll be talking about today, the Iowa Wisconsin study, that's the Virtual Education Research Alliance. And for REAL Northeast and Islands, that's the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance. So I just want to make it really clear that the work, it's the researchers presenting here, but the work really reflects the input and the expertise of a lot of different folks over a period of time. Before I get to the research questions, before I move forward, I actually want to stop and give people a chance to ask any questions or make any comments about this notion of research alliances, and find out if any of you are maybe working with other researchers as part of alliance, or if you have a research alliance, or if you have any questions about what this endeavor of these researcher practitioner partnerships entails. I'm not going to wait. I'm going to keep my eye on the chat box. It's something I think we'll definitely want to touch on later on, but please jump in if you have any questions. Actually, I know something that I'd like to ask before we move too far forward. At this point, I'd like to have a sense of, and if people would just take a moment to type into the chat box. I know that Lori and Darcy are full-time teachers, and I see in the chat box that Brad Pearson is an online English teacher. So, but if the rest of you all would really quickly just type in what your role is. Are you a researcher, practitioner? I'm going to wait just a second just to get a sense of who our audience is. I know Amy is a practitioner, online consultant and part-time researcher. Oh, an administrator of product development, another teacher. And Diana, nice to see you. We're running another online and blended learning alliance for the REAL program down in the Southeast, down in Florida and South Carolina. Oh, great. Jared, another researcher. Angela, wonderful. All right, so we have a nice mix of researchers and practitioners and others. So before the research questions appear here on a slide, but before I spend too much time or any time talking about them, I'd like to just provide a little bit of context for the studies that we conducted with our research alliances. So as everybody on this call knows, online learning has been growing at a rapid pace for at least the past 15 years. But the rate at which online learning has grown and the rate at which it's used by students in the United States varies enormously across the state. So those of us who follow the work of the Keeping Pace reports that come out every year out of Evergreen know that the policies that states have in place that allow or support online learning vary. The number of state-level programs can really vary, or even whether there is a state-level online program varies quite a bit. But complicating our understanding of exactly what's happening, so how our schools using online courses, is really complicated by the fact that with just a couple of exceptions, states don't collect data about whether or not students are taking online courses. And they don't know, so at the minimum, with the exception of maybe Michigan and Florida, I think, most states can't tell you how many students have enrolled in an online course, what kinds of courses that they've taken, and we don't know why students in schools are turning to online courses. In fact, does anybody else? I'd actually really like to know if anybody knows what states do keep track of this. Diana, if you could confirm what I think is true about Florida, that would be great. Oh, and Randy, you're in Canada. Sorry, I've just been talking about the U.S. My apologies. Oh, so Arkansas does collect this data? Huh. Well, that's a good thing to know. That's great. So really just a handful of states. And Catherine, I'm pretty sure Michigan does. I mean, that's how you all do your research, right? Ah, yes, that's right. So online schools collect this data for themselves. That's absolutely right. But if there's multiple state-level programs, or if there's not a state-level program, it then makes it difficult to really know what the extent to which schools and students are using online courses. So just some context for the study. So when we started our work, with our research alliances, one of the most pressing questions our practitioner members were about this issue. So most of the members in the Realm Midwest Virtual Education Research Alliance lead state-level programs, but they only know about what's going on in their program. So they really wanted to know across their states, how are schools using online courses for students? So what kinds of courses and what's the academic objective of those courses? Why are schools using to online courses? So instead of offering a face-to-face course, why are they choosing to fulfill a particular academic goal with an online course? And what challenges do schools encounter in using online courses? So I'm actually not going to, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the next slide, but before I go to that slide, because it has a lot of words on it, I actually just want to provide a little bit of background about our own states that we're going to be talking about, and then I'll be handing it over to my colleagues to talk about how we conducted these survey studies and what we found. So just to give an example of how, how online course use varies, around the country, I'm going to start with Iowa, which is one of our states. Iowa Learning Online, which is now the Department of Education's, state-level online program. It's been in existence since 2004. And in 2013, the state actually began appropriation. So they began, directly funding Iowa Learning Online. So they have there's a state-level program. There are state regulations that name this particular program as a state-level program, and it receives funding from the state. In Wisconsin, there's been a state-level program, and the exact date is escaping me, but I think since about 2003. In 2007, Wisconsin passed some legislation that really outlined what the requirements were for online courses. At this point in Wisconsin, you have Wisconsin Virtual School, and you have Wisconsin eSchool Network, but they are now collaborating with each other with the support of the Department of Education, right? So we have all these different models. And then quickly about New York. New York actually didn't even have any, even though people were using online courses, there wasn't actually anything in the law until 2010 that said that students could earn a credit with an online course. And initially it was just for credit recovery. In 2011, right, which isn't that long ago, they passed a law saying that yes, students can complete graduation requirements using an online course, but in New York State, not only is there no funding for online learning, but there's not a level virtual education program. So we can see how different the context is in these different states. So now I'm actually going to turn it over. I'm going to have first Erin and then Jackie talk about how we conducted these two studies, and then they're going to go over some of the findings. And then please jump in with questions or comments at any point. All right, Erin, I'm handing.
Great, thanks, Peggy. So as we turned to our first project, which was our project in Iowa and Wisconsin, I think for us as researchers, and I like that there's a mix of both researchers and practitioners on the phone today, or on the call today, because I think sometimes as researchers we have ideas about what we want to study. And so when we really sat in our research alliance and talked to our members about what they wanted to know, as Peggy said, a lot of what they wanted to know in their state was really sort of simple, basic information about what people were taking, why they were taking it, why schools were turning to online courses. And so what we did was a really collaborative process of survey development. And sometimes I know from a research perspective this takes time, and I know for our practitioners it takes time for them out of their days of doing their work. But I think what came out for us was a really productive process of talking out not only what the questions were going to be, but really what some of the issues were that were underlying them. So the process that we went through, we found there's many surveys that are out there, and many of them are really good, but as many of us know that sometimes they need to be adapted to the context in which they're in. So we took those surveys, we developed some new items, we did some cognitive interviewing, so going out and actually testing the survey with people in Iowa and Wisconsin, and then refined the survey for finally administration 2 years ago now. And so when we did that survey, in terms of administration, it was actually administered by the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction and the Iowa Department of Education. And so those entities sent those out. We did a survey in Iowa and Wisconsin, a randomly selected representative sample of public high schools. And so those high schools did cover public charters, vocational technical schools, and then all brick and mortar public schools. It did not include cyber charters, though, and that was just because we really wanted to focus on the brick and mortar atmosphere. And so what we got in terms of a response rate, 117 of the 168 schools that we contacted in Iowa responded, which was 70% response rate, which we thought was pretty great. And then in Wisconsin, we got 96 of the 168 that were in our sampling frame, which was 57%. So we felt pretty good about the return rate that we got, and we felt that our members felt like they could confidently go back and say something about their state's programs at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jackie to talk a little bit about the New York project and how their project.
Thanks, Erin. So for the New York project, the project was conducted through the Northeast Rural District Research Alliance, and in particular, we worked in collaboration with the Capital Area School Development Association, and called CASDA. CASDA is a study council affiliated with the School of Education at the University at Albany, which is a state university of New York. And their mission is to raise awareness of education challenges, and they convene educators to analyze and respond to those challenges. So working with the CASDA leadership, who served as the main advisors on this study, we adapted the survey that was used for Iowa and Wisconsin for the New York context. And we went through a similar process of doing cognitive interviews to make sure that the questions were relevant to the schools in the New York region. So CASDA administered this survey to all of its 99 public high schools. And to give you a sense of the member schools, 57% of these high schools are located in rural areas, 17% are in towns, and 26% are in cities or suburban areas. And 91% of these schools are eligible for Title I subsidies. So that gives you just an idea of the region in New York. And so of the 99 public high schools that received the survey, 59 responded to the survey, 35 of which used online courses in the 2012-13 school year. And similar to the analyses done in Iowa and Wisconsin, we did an analysis of the responders and non-responders in New York, and the characteristics of those who responded and didn't respond to the survey were similar. And so for the rest of the findings that we'll talk about today, the results refer to those schools that reported enrolling students in online courses during the 2012-13 school year. So now I'm going to jump into some of our key findings. So the first graph here shows you the percent of schools indicating whether their students were enrolled in online courses for each of these academic objectives. And what you can see here is across all three, Iowa, Wisconsin, and the New York Capital Region, credit recovery was one of the key academic objectives. In New York, so if you look at the bottom three columns, you would see that credit recovery in New York was really the main reason for using online courses, and that is probably reflecting the legislation that Peggy mentioned. While in Iowa and Wisconsin, they were using it for credit recovery, but they were also using it for other purposes, including core academic courses, as well as dual enrollment in college courses in Iowa, and then elective courses and core courses in Wisconsin. Although we don't report it here in terms of the, in this presentation, in terms of the subjects, in all three regions, schools reported enrolling students in online courses primarily in the four primary academic subjects: history and social studies, math, English, and science. The order of them was slightly different, so history was the most common in New York and Iowa, while math was the most common in Wisconsin. Now, before I jump into the reasons why schools enrolled students in online courses, I thought we could open this up on the chat to just see what reasons you all think schools were enrolling students in online courses. So if you just want to enter in some of your ideas into the chat box, I'll pause for a moment and then I'll flip to what we found. So I see some comments about credit recovery and schools without resources to provide students with specialized courses. Excellent. So I'm going to, oh, we have a few more. Scheduling changes, course offerings. Yeah, so you'll see that many of these are the reasons that were reported. And again, in this slide, we're showing for all all three. I'm not sure what happened to the labels here, but they follow the same pattern as above. So it should be Iowa, Wisconsin, and then the New York capital region. Oh no. Okay. You'll see in all three, again, providing credit recovery opportunities was a very important reason, or somewhat important reason, that schools enrolled students in online courses. And then you'll see most of the same items are showing up again in the 3 different states, but just in different orders. So providing students with an alternative learning environment, reducing scheduling conflicts, providing personalized learning opportunities. These were all reasons why schools were enrolling students in online courses. In terms of things that were at the lower end of the list were items like space limitations. Those were not the reasons why schools were using online courses. Now I'm going to turn it back to Erin to talk about some of the challenges that schools are facing.
Great, thanks, Jackie. I think also, similar in the way that Jackie just did for you, I think we're going to turn it to you. What do you see, either in your practice or in the research that you do, what do you see as some of the main challenges that states and districts and programs are facing in actually implementing online learning? So if you just want to type in the chat box, any challenges you think people are currently facing in implementation? Oh, are we pushing the wrong kids? That was a big concern for a lot of our members. Who's taking online courses and how are they getting there and who's pushing them to take them? Knowing how to learn online, and is that a particular skill set that maybe is or is not being offered for students to get them ready? Reliance on parents. And similar to that, we see reliance in some cases with the brick and mortar, with them having a monitor or a coach or somebody with them along the way. Flexibility, interesting. Yep, Justin, I'm right on there with you with the mentors and monitors. So as you can see, there's a lot of challenges, and I think this is really important to our states when we implemented the survey, was to really identify what are some of the big things that are out there, because they didn't know from their schools why they might be turning to it and why they're not turning to it. So these are for schools who are implementing online learning. These are the large challenges that they were finding. And in Iowa and Wisconsin, this question was asked the exact same way, but our stakeholders for New York wanted that question tweaked a little bit differently. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But as you can see, in Iowa, the biggest concern was lack of teacher training. We don't have percentages on there, but it's about 61% that expressed concern over that. Following with things like course quality, access to technology. So these are the top 5. The interesting thing about in Iowa, we did also ask them where they're getting their courses from. So who are the providers? And that was things like your local district or state virtual program, post-secondary institution. And in Iowa, the majority of their courses were coming from post-secondary institutions. And so this is a perspective that was interesting for our member from Iowa, because she said, well, I could see now why they'd be concerned about teacher training, because a lot of them are taking college courses. Dual credit is really big in Iowa. And so that was interesting to her. Now, if we switch over to Wisconsin, we start talking about their highest concern was over course quality. And so many of their courses turned out were coming from local districts and from Wisconsin Virtual School. And so funding, student interest, so you see some of the top 5 ones. They're not the same as they were in Iowa, which led to a lot of interesting conversations between our 2 stakeholders there. about what's the different context in their state. But course quality was a big thing, and it was a major concern for that perception. Now, of course, I think one thing we do know is that these are people's perceptions. So whether teacher training was happening or not, or course quality was really an issue or not, these are people's perceptions of these issues. As we turn into the New York, course quality again, and this question was asked a little bit differently, but course quality again was the highest concern for folks, followed by things like academic integrity. I'm sure you guys see this a lot, student interest, access to technology. So you see some overlaps here, but I think it also points a lot to context and what's going on in these states in terms of what people are finding as their core challenges. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back. Oh, I guess I'm going to turn it back over to myself. So I'm going to keep on moving on. So as we talk about what does this all mean for us, and we're going to give you, there's access to these reports. We actually have more findings, but we decided to focus on these ones because they were the ones that, for our members, were really some of the biggest points of conversation. And I think when we talk as researchers, and I think that's what's great about this community, we have particular things that we think about in terms of what the implications of some of these findings might be. You know, if you see in Wisconsin that they're concerned over course quality, or in Iowa that they're concerned over teacher training, what would some of our research questions then move to? Would we look at further implementations of those things? Would we do evaluations of what the training practices are? Of course quality, let's look further at what some of the course providers are. So for us, as researchers, if we see something like credit recovery being big in both states, you start wanting to organize and design studies around the outcomes for credit recovery students. So what are their outcomes? Who are those students? How are they getting into online learning? And who's providing their courses? When we talk about research going forward, I think this idea of the state collecting data, and I know there was a little bit of a chat around it, but I think this idea of who's tracking the data, so we can follow, you know, who takes high school English across the state, but who's enrolled in online learning is really difficult in a lot of places. And as we start to think about larger studies about tracking outcomes, who's completing courses, how are they doing, what supports are they getting, it gets a little bit more complicated. So from a research perspective, for the New York, or for the Iowa and Wisconsin study, those are things that talking about the quality of the data, who's collecting it, and where it's collected was really important to us. Another part of our study, which we didn't talk about today, was on-site monitoring or coaching or that person at the school. And that's another area that's ripe for research. And there's more information about what we found in that in our report. But I think that's another area, and I know the Michigan Virtual and focusing on that. And that's another area for you researchers out there. What supports are students getting? So I think for us as researchers, that's sort of what we took away from the Iowa and Wisconsin. In talking to our education practitioners, though, for Iowa and Wisconsin in our VERA stakeholder group, it was interesting to see their reactions to some of the results and what that led them to think about. So take a case like our friends in Wisconsin. So about 30% or so saw the issue with course quality in Wisconsin. And for us, 30%, you know, didn't seem like quite a lot. You know, it seems like, oh, okay, there's probably, you know, that's not that much. But for our stakeholder in Wisconsin, 30+% of people concerned about course quality was a big issue for her. And so that led them to several conversations internally about what they wanted to do about that, what their marketing campaign was, how they ensured course quality, and led to a lot of conversations both within the Wisconsin Virtual School and the eSchool Network and the state in general about what they were going to do. In the case of Iowa, with their training being a potential issue, we start to talk about, you know, a lot of their presenters are, or a lot of their providers are dual enrollment, are so university, post-secondary institutions. And so what's that communication between the two of them? and how are their professors being trained to teach students who might be in their courses. And so that led to a lot of really interesting conversations about practice and policy and how they were going to interface with post-secondary institutions around their online courses. So that's sort of some of the conversation and research things that built up for Iowa and Wisconsin. I'm going to turn it back to Jackie to talk a little bit about what some of the implications were for New York.
Great. Yeah, so the main implications for the study in New York was really around the predominant use of online courses for credit recovery, combined with the finding about schools' concerns about students' educational experiences in the online courses. And I think these two findings together highlighted the need for additional information about how schools are using online courses for credit recovery, how students are being supported in those courses, and how students are doing academically in those courses. And especially because there has been some research to suggest that completion rates in credit recovery courses are low, I think that this study just highlighted the need for more information about the ways that the online credit recovery courses are set up and how students can be supported to succeed in them. You know, in addition, similar to some of the implications from the Midwest study, I think one of the implications in terms of supporting students was whether or not having a on-site monitor or a coach could help support students in these credit recovery courses. And, you know, in terms of things that were talked about quite a bit with the CASDA leadership was this were discussions about the use of online courses, but then also the fact that in the region, distance learning and primarily video conferencing was used often as well to expand opportunities available to students. But those courses were typically used for dual credit or elective courses, while the online courses were primarily focused on credit recovery. And so we had some interesting conversations about how it would be interesting to investigate why schools are choosing to do an online course versus a video conferencing course and how that might look in the future. And then in terms of future research, I think there are many open opportunities here for further study, particularly around credit recovery, to learn how schools are implementing online learning, the academic outcomes, both whether they receive the credit and how students fare in subsequent courses, as well as what can be done at the brick and mortar school in order to support these support these students. And finally, just thinking about, you know, do online credit recovery courses, are they more effective or less effective than face-to-face credit recovery courses? And then also thinking about the cost effectiveness. Are they more or less cost effective than having face-to-face credit recovery courses? And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Peggy.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Jackie and Erin. So we'd really like to hear from you about any questions or comments that you have. One of the things that we're going to, as you just heard Erin and Jackie do, is provide some of our own reflections on, you know, what we learned from the work, and we'd really like very much to hear some of the things that you all had to say. I wanted to point out one of the comments that one of the people in the audience made, and that's our colleague Diana Sharp. I love Scott's comment early on when we were asking why schools use online courses, and he talked about, I think, Scott, is that right? I hope I got the right person, talking about online credit recovery being the wild, wild west. So one of the things you've heard us talk about is, you know, that online credit recovery is predominant, or was in this particular school year, which is the 2012-2013 school year, was predominant. in Wisconsin, Iowa, and New York. We haven't had a survey from the U.S. Department of Education in a while, but one will probably come out at the beginning of next year. Every 5 years, the Department of Education does a big survey study where they ask districts, not schools, but districts, about their use of what they call technology-based distance learning, a lot of it, which is online learning. And one of the things the most recent survey showed was that the most common use of online learning nationally as well was credit recovery. But I just wanted to point out that there were a couple of interesting comments we had from our colleagues on this call. Diana pointing out that I think her group is working on a study about online credit recovery in Florida, which is going to be a really important study because Florida is such a big state. And then another one of our colleagues, another one of us on this call, I guess it was Scott, referred to a McCabe and Sant Andrea study in 2012. Scott, if you have a link to that study, that would be great. Let's see, and now I'm down at the bottom. Randy says that his takeaway is that the drivers for online learning are different in Canada than in the U.S. That you guys are compiling research for your State of the Nation review in Canada. Yeah, so Randy, one of the things you had said earlier in the comment section was that you thought originally Canada had been really using online learning a lot for credit recovery, but that the shift was more for core courses. Randy, the way that I read your comment, though, and just let me know if I'm right, was that it wasn't necessarily core courses for the general student population, but it was core courses for particular student populations who maybe, and I would, were having difficulty or had some other kind of challenges. Is that right? So that for every student, it's a part of their core program. So I don't want to, one of the things I think it's just to point out what, while Randy's finishing typing, I'm the one researcher that's presenting today that worked pretty intensively on both the studies, and it was really fascinating to me, not surprising, but really very interesting, how different the policy contexts were in the 3 states, how different the programmatic contexts are. I know that New York State, I think really for the first time, is really even bringing together a group this summer to begin to think about how to effectively use online learning. And if you look at the slide that we have up right now, I mean, you can almost really, now I'm not saying that this is the cause of the differences and challenges, but you can see in the 2 states where the states have been thinking about this for a longer period of time. You've got a longer history of regulations and laws. You can see that even though there are some challenges, certainly with the exception of the lack of teacher training in Iowa, for most of the challenges that we listed in the survey, fewer than half of the schools identified them. All right, so now Randy's had a chance to write a lot, and I want to give us a chance to look at his comments, because I think what he has to say about Canada is potentially very interesting, and I want to give us a chance to do that. Half of your students take 1 or more courses online. That's very interesting. Oh yeah, and Erin, thanks for pointing that out about the challenges. Yeah, that's very interesting. And Randy, I don't know if you know this, but well, you probably do. But some states in the United States are beginning to mandate. I think Michigan's an example, right, Catherine and Justin? That in Michigan, kids have to take an online course to graduate from high school. Virginia too, huh? So Erin, do you want to respond to Catherine's comment about sort of how you might, and I don't want to put you on the spot, so if you want to take a pass, please be sure to take a pass. Catherine's comment about the Iowa teachers and how you've thought about that particular finding, the teacher training in Iowa.
Sure. I think this is an interesting one because we had, I think, a similar thought when we first saw the results as a research team. But I think the one thing that came out from really working with our collaborators through this was that it was people's perceptions of teacher training, because there is, teacher training that's provided by Iowa Learning Online. There's teacher training that is provided at some of the universities. And so this question is aimed at school personnel perceptions of what's going on. So I agree with you, Catherine, there is a lot going on. This question doesn't necessarily point to the fact that teacher training isn't happening, but that there's a disconnect at some point between there. So that's kind of the way that we took it after talking with our peer members. But yeah, I think it's a good point in terms of research, is that you can see that and say, wow, teachers aren't being trained. And that's not necessarily what it says.
The other thing, and again, what I'm doing here is just surmising, I guess, about what the findings might mean. But one of the things we saw in the Iowa and Wisconsin report, so actually let me just pause for a second. The Iowa, there's some differences in the report that came out of the Midwest and the report that came out of the Northeast. And the reason why, I think, is that, well, the main reason why is because as REL researchers, we wanted to make sure that we were conducting the studies that answered the questions that our stakeholder partners had. And in the Midwest, a really big priority for our partners in terms of their own practice, in terms of running online programs that serve kids, primarily kids who are enrolled in brick and mortar schools. They really privilege, it's very important to them, the idea that students enrolled in online courses should have access to different kinds of support. So support from an online teacher, and support from someone on site as well, so a school monitor or coach or something along those lines. So the differences, I'll eventually get back to my original point, but there's the differences in the two reports. The report out of the Midwest included many more questions about the kinds of online experiences that kids had. So, for example, did they have direct access to communicate with a teacher? How were the schools monitoring their students' performance and engagement in online courses? And whether there was somebody at the school who had been appointed to monitor and support kids who were enrolled in online courses. So now I'm back to my original point about the findings and this issue of the perceived challenge of the lack of teacher training in Iowa. One of the things we saw was that and I'm not going to remember the exact percentage off the top of my head, but a number of the Iowa schools were using not the state level virtual education program, but were in addition to colleges, but we're going out and accessing, schools or districts were accessing online courses and implementing them on their own. And so there were actually quite a few quite a few schools that reported that they didn't think that students always had the chance to communicate with an online teacher. And so I think to some extent, that might have reflected the context in Iowa as well, the fact that there wasn't always an online teacher, or maybe the schools or districts were implementing the online courses themselves and so needed training for their own teachers. But I think, I think Erin's point is probably the most important one, this issue of kids, secondary level kids accessing post-secondary courses, and whether there's possibly a developmental mismatch there.
Peggy, I will also say that at the time we conducted the study in Wisconsin, Wisconsin had a law or a statute that said that in order to teach online, you had to have so many hours of training to teach online, which that has since changed since we've done the survey. But I think it also says something about when people would go out and recruit students to potentially take these courses, that they were ensured that the teachers would have had that training. And so that's not the same currently in 2015, but when we did the survey, and so I think that also might be an interesting point to why the lack of teacher training was not as much of an issue in Wisconsin. So it's cause for further research as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're getting close to the end of our time. I just want to give folks just sort of, in finishing up the report, some of the thoughts that we had and talked about was given that, especially since there's not state level data in a lot of places, but there might be district level data, and there are a lot of questions about how kids, why schools are using online courses, why kids are enrolling in them, and how they're doing. Given that the RAIL wants to help states and schools and districts use their data and think about how to use their data. One of the I guess recommendations, for lack of a better word, that we point out at the end of the report is that, if districts might want to look, or online programs might want to look and see, well, how are we implementing online learning? Why are kids taking these courses? What courses are they taking? Tracking how kids are performing in online courses. I'd actually like to hear, I think it's Darcy and I think it was Lori who teach the PE courses. I'd be interested in just hearing from them, like how they think kids typically perform in these online health and PE courses. Do they have high rates of course completion? Are kids pretty motivated? Some of the other implications of our studies, and these are things that we're continuing to investigate in our own work, are what kinds of supports kids may receive from the online teacher or from the brick and mortar staff person who's responsible for overseeing the students. We know, given that there's so much use of online courses for credit recovery, I think we probably all recognize the need for more research there, finding out how are schools using online courses to provide credit recovery opportunities, and importantly, what are the short and long-term academic outcomes of kids who are taking those courses. Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks, Cabell, for it's funny, I finished talking and then I'm making a comment about the chat. I was not saying that my own comment was very interesting. I'm trying to do two things at once. So I think that's pretty much about what we have. I want to give Jackie and Erin a chance to jump in if I've forgotten something or something else we need to point out. But I want to encourage, actually, thank you. I want to encourage people to go to the enrollment website. You can find more information about the body of work that the Virtual Education Research Alliance is engaged in at that website. You can download the reports there. There are also short versions of the reports and infographics, so graphic representations. So there's the Enrollment West website and the RELNE website. If you have any questions, please direct them to me and I'll take them to the rest of the research group. We want to thank MVLRI very much for the invitation to present and for the opportunity to hear from people. And we want to thank everybody who joined for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Peggy, Jackie, and Erin. That was a fantastic and comprehensive presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to present us with that. Very helpful. Before we wrap up, we did just want to point you to a few ongoing MVLRI initiatives. We have an ongoing podcast where we talk with folks who work in the area of blended and online learning, whether it's in research or in practice, and we talk about how research informs that practice or research informs their work. We have recently just begun a series where we're talking with different representatives from different states who have course choice programs or course access programs. In our latest podcast episode, we talk with Kate Lockery out of the Texas Virtual School Network about some of the ins and outs of their course access program. We also have an ongoing guest blogger program, so if you're interested in writing for us, if you'd like to highlight some of your own research or some of your own work in the area of online and blended learning, please reach out to us. Click that link there. You can read more about that initiative to find out what blogging for us would entail. We have an upcoming webinar next Wednesday, 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern. We'll be hearing from Jason Richardson from the University of Kentucky on the challenges of virtual school leadership, and he'll be highlighting some of his research in that area. So we encourage you to join us for that. We will be sending out emails to those of you who are on our email list, so you can add that to your calendar. You can also find it at our website at mvlri.org. In the meantime, if you'd like to keep in touch with us, you can reach out to us via email, provide us with some feedback on how these webinars are going for you, if they're meeting your needs. You can sign up for our mailing list by clicking the link there, and you can find us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handles are listed there, as well as our LinkedIn page and our YouTube channel, where we host the recordings of all of our webinars. You can expect the recording of this webinar to go up pretty shortly as well. We have all of our upcoming webinars listed at our website at mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. I see there's a chat comment here about a PDF link for the presentation. We'll be posting the recording of the YouTube video, but I will include my email address, and I'd be happy to email you a PDF or a PowerPoint presentation, whichever you prefer the slide deck to be in. I will be happy to email that to you if you reach out to me. With that, I will see everyone hopefully in the future. Everyone have a great week. Take care.